How many are we expecting, Samantha?
Hey there.
It looks like they're
Yep.
coming in.
Yeah.
Oops, someone got scared away.
So I'll just give about 1-2 minutes more, then we'll start.
I think I said this last time, but someone pointed out it's like waiting for popcorn. Like you don't want to burn it, but you want to have as many kernels as
Science.
possible.
Yes.
Wait. I am sharing my screen again, right?
Yes. Okay. I think we can start. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining the webinar on scientific writing. And this is a 3-part series, and this is the last part of our 3-part series. And it has been organized by International Epidemiological Association. And we've been grateful to have Dr. McFarland presenting all the 3 parts. And those who have joined for the first time, my name is Moline. I'm the International Epidemiological Association Early Career Epidemiologist Representative for the African region. So we organize these activities towards career development for early career epidemiologists who are members of the International Epidemiological Association. But some of the activities, we also invite non-members. And just to mention that we are also planning an in-person scientific writing workshop next year. And again, Dr. McFarland will be facilitating that workshop. And but this will target only early career epidemiologists who are members of the International Epidemiology of Association. If there are non-members who have joined this webinar and you are interested in joining the association, please contact Samantha, who is the Executive Director of International Epidemiology Association. So Samantha, you may share your email address in the chat. And we are so privileged to have Dr. McFarland presenting this series on scientific writing. And he is a professor of epidemiology and biostatistics at University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, and director of the Center for Public Health Research at San Francisco Department of Public Health, with nearly 30 years of experience in teaching scientific writing globally. He has authored more than 500 peer-reviewed publications and leads cutting-edge research on HIV prevention and epidemiology. We are very privileged to have you, Dr. McFarland, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malene. Well, welcome everybody who's been here before. Welcome back. If you haven't been here before, you're kind of catching the tail end of these series of presentations. The topics that we're going to do a deeper dive on for today are the discussion, then the introduction, then the methods. And if you have been here before, you know that that strange order is deliberate. The idea that I'm proposing of keeping a paper moving forward is that you begin with the 3 tables and figures. And the idea there is if you complete your analysis, the story you're going to tell, the message you're going to give, should be visible in the 3 tables and 1 figure. Progress from the 3 tables and 1 figure directly to the results, because the table, what happens in the results section is the story that's there in the numbers and figures becomes written in the results section. And you don't write everything in the tables and figures, but what you're saying is, let me tell you the most important points of the story. Now, here's where we've left off. Once you've written the facts of the story, the numbers and figures, the progression then goes to saying the meaning of those numbers. So in other words, we're setting aside the introduction for the moment to progress right from the story in numbers, the story in words, the story's meaning. And that's the discussion section. That's where we are today. And from there, then we flip up to the introduction. I'll say more on that. And I tend to leave the methods for last, which I think is probably not the sequence that a lot of people do because they have a study protocol and they can kind of plunk in the methods. They might have their dissertation or master's thesis and they'll already feel that the methods is complete. That's good. But even if you do that, I'll recommend that you go back to the method section at the very end, making sure it covers everything. Now, we've divided these seminar series up into 3 parts. I think I will probably only be able to cover today these 3 sections, but that gets us through the main sections of a paper. I've given permission to get free access to all my slides. I think there's 263 or 270. It's based on a full whole course at UCSF. You'll see there are other topics. There's topics on the abstracts, the references, how to choose a journal, how to respond to peer reviewers, ethical considerations. You're welcome to look at those slides, make sense of them on your own, and you're welcome to use them as well for your own groups of researchers. Okay, the discussion section. This would have been better to do this like 3 weeks ago during Halloween because I know that most people's feedback has been that the discussion section is the scariest part of writing a paper, that this is the one that they have the greatest anxiety over. I actually find it the most fun and the most interesting. But let me try to give you the tool to get over this fear and anxiety. So I know it's anxiety provoking because it feels like it is the most important section. This is the section that you highlight the public health impact of your study. It's the part where you're really being more interpretive. You're showing what you do know. It's more creative in writing. And therefore, I think a lot of these factors result in this section having the most writer's block, the one that's hardest to get a start on, keep moving, thinking about, well, what do I say? What do I say next? So let me give you the format, the framework or the model that I use to keep things moving, to keep it simple. It expands from there, so it's a starting point. But if you were part of the other sessions, you'll know that I've divided everything into 4 easy digestible parts that I hope will make sense. Part number 1, I call the mission accomplished section. And what you're looking for here is the first sentence of the first paragraph of the discussion is a very clear articulation of the single most important finding. And in fact, this is one of those places that I said editors will skip right to that sentence and say, just give me the point. Just give me the message. What's the take home? They will look right there. When I read papers, I flip right to that sentence. For example, if they're saying this is a randomized controlled trial, you want to know right away, did it work? Did it work? Did it work? That's exactly where you would put that. So they would find it immediately. The second section is I call it the not only that. And the idea behind this is if people are only going to take home one single message, it should be there in that first paragraph, in that first sentence of the first paragraph. If you've accomplished that mission, then you're free to kind of say, okay, there are some other things that I wish to tell you. If you're still with me, here's what I want to say. So these are things like the secondary findings, the other things that are exciting about it. What I find part of the writer's block of the discussion section is that you want to say everything exciting all at once. And this is really hard to organize. So pull out that single most important finding as if it's all you're going to say. And then you should feel the relief of saying, okay, if you're still with me, let me just say a few other things. The third part is what I call the mea culpa, and you'll recognize this. This is the limitations paragraph. This is a requirement. Now, sometimes it even has a separate heading under the discussion, but even if it doesn't have a heading, it's almost always in the exact same place in every single manuscript. It's not first, and it's not last. It's sort of next to last. And you can probably see the psychology of this, right? That if you began your discussion section with the limitations, then you're almost saying to the reader, the message is this study was bad. This study has flaws. This study has biases. And they may end there. If you end with it, psychologically, you're leaving the reader with a bad feeling in their minds, right? That's the last thing they read when they put your paper down. They have the biases on their mind. So it's almost always tucked into that next to last position. The other point of the mea culpa, and in addition to the scientific rigor of noting the potential biases, it's also the place that you now have an opportunity to address those biases. So in other words, you know there's particular biases, but you still have faith in your results. They're still rigorous. You can back it up. You've made your case. You can't do that unless you first acknowledge that there is a potential bias. So the limitations paragraph is both pointing out the flaws, but it's also pointing out why the study still has strengths. The final point, and again, if the psychology is do not end on the limitations, the final point is to end on a high note, to end on something very positive, something uplifting, something that says the way forward. Now, this is true even if what you're pointing out is tragic, a rising mortality rate, very high prevalence of a fatal disease. What you're still saying is, look, we can identify the challenges, we can start to tackle them. Here is what we need to do next. So that points to the future, points to the way forward, highlights the importance of your study in that trajectory. And that psychologically leaves the reader, the editor, the reviewers with very positive feelings about the importance of your study. So again, I understand that the discussion can be very daunting, very much open-ended, but if you can actually find a pattern in the way discussion sections are written. So they don't necessarily have all the subheadings that, say, a method section would have, but you can begin to structure it around this format. Okay. Actually, I did want to offer that do feel free to put questions in the chat, and Samantha will find an opportune moment to maybe break in and let me know, and I can answer it, before the topic goes too far away. Or if you're bold, I know there's 70, 80 people on, do feel free to just interrupt. It makes me feel this is a little more interactive. I mean, actually, usually we don't do this by Zoom. This is done in person or in smaller groups on Zoom. So do offer that you can ask questions along the way. Okay, let me circle back and do even a little bit more deeper dive. So what is the mission accomplished? Again, this is the beginning. This is the first paragraph, and it's the first sentence. It's also that elevator test. If you remember, this technique of finding your message early on was to imagine that you get in an elevator with a colleague or a supervisor or a boss, and there's sort of a very brief moment where it's quiet, they have your attention, and they say, "Oh, what did you find in that study you did?" And it's very quickly you should be able to think on your feet. I cannot get into too much detail all at once. I have to say very succinctly what the take-home message is. So that sentence that you would come up within the elevator would be that first sentence of this paragraph. The other way of thinking about it is it could be the newspaper headline, which often are not full sentences, but the idea is think of a reader picking up a newspaper and just skimming the headlines to see what they might want to read. That would be another way of crafting it. The other thing that it is, and this I'll go into a little bit more detail, that first sentence is the answer to a question that you're going to pose in the introduction. And this is why I'm saying hold off on the introduction for the moment, go back later. Right. So this first sentence of the first paragraph of the discussion. And I usually, even if I don't stick with it in the final editing, I usually get the juices flowing by simply saying, "We found," and just fill in that blank as quickly and as simply as you can do. "We found X." I know some people don't like to use the first person, so they change it up to "our data show." That's also perfectly acceptable. Or you can say the study found if you want to keep it in the third person. So I saw some things in the chat had gone by. Was there I sort of get a little flag of the chat. Was any questions that we want to take on at this point?
No, sorry. A bunch of people are giving me their emails because they want parts 1 and 2 of your series.
Oh, excellent, excellent.
Thank
Yes.
you.
As we've gone, I've updated and edited a little bit along the way, but each time I actually have sent the whole thing. So whichever one you have handy, you can send. I sent one this morning to Moline. I don't think I really changed that much though.
Okay.
Okay. So state the most important finding concisely and accurately. Keep it in a single sentence. Now here I'll ask you to put in the chat. If you've heard my other lectures, you'll know what I think the ideal sentence should be in terms of the number of words. Who remembers how many words should a typical well-formed English sentence be? Anyone? Anyone? Are any popping in? Maybe they're timid
Sorry,
to
not
say.
yet. Oh, hang on. One person guessed 20 to 30, one said 11, one said 44, one said 15.
Oh no, they're all over the place. The first one I thought was gonna have it. My concrete answer is 22. A good English sentence should be 22 words. And it's funny that my English teacher, I said this before in high school, told me this 30 plus years ago. Actually, gosh, it's more like 40 actually. Oh my God, it's 45. I'm getting sold. It was actually my 60th birthday yesterday. I should keep that in mind. 22 words is what she had said then. And she also pointed out that historically in English writing that has decreased over time. And you can also Google it, though I think it will still say if you or ChatGPT or something, if you ask how long should an English sentence be, that's the answer. The other part, the other thing that you do with that sentence is it's the topic sentence of that paragraph, right? So if you're thinking, okay, I've said my mission accomplished, now what? Well, that format of English writing, again, is topic sentence, 3 supporting sentence, transition to the next paragraph. So what you're doing is you're filling up the remainder of that paragraph with things that support that conclusion, that message. And what you're doing in this paragraph is you're putting your best case forward. Don't hold back. Put all your punches. Look for the supporting data within your own study. Look for corroborating data from other studies. And now this is where you're starting to make outside comparisons. Highlight the strength of your study. Highlight the biological mechanisms that support that conclusion. Should you be saying limitations? Should you sort of soften those sentences to be a little bit more uncertain? My advice is don't do that here. You will have a whole paragraph on the limitations, so don't put the limitations right in this first paragraph. Make your strongest case and later say, here are the potential biases. Let me give you what is my favorite example. This is not something I wrote or something that wasn't one of my mentees or students that wrote, but it was like one of the best examples. I wish I had written it because it's one of the best examples of what I'm saying. It was written a long time ago, 20 years ago in Zimbabwe. And that first sentence of the first paragraph of this publication said HIV prevalence among women in antenatal clinics decreased from 2000 to 2004 in Zimbabwe. At that time, that kind of was marking a turning point in the epidemic. So it was very important. Notice that it's very succinct, it's very accurate, it's very precise. It's only 14 words. So that makes me very happy. So someone said 14 words. That can be a good guess. That sentence being so short and crisp and up front and center packs a lot of punch. That is the message of the data that they're showing. They're showing trends in antenatal clinic prevalence. Where do they go from here? Okay, so if that's the first sentence, the remaining sentences in that paragraph, one after another, support that statement. This decline was seen in all age groups, in all provinces, in all locations. Short, crisp sentence. 3 local research studies also found declines in HIV prevalence during the same period. Reference, reference, reference. The decline is similar in magnitude to that experienced by Uganda. The trend is corroborated by changes in reported sexual behaviors in our surveys. So you see what I mean? This really is driving home this message as strongly as they can. Every single sentence here is less than 22 words, very crisp, very clear, very accurate. Are there limitations to these data? Of course there are. But this was not the place that they were going to do that. They're going to say, let us interpret these data the best way we can, the strongest way we can. The limitations will come later. Okay. Now here's another example in the published literature. Again, it wasn't me, but I remember reading this paper and just thinking, wow, they really missed an opportunity. They missed a beat here. If you look at the first sentence of the first paragraph, it says, the study was the first randomized clinical trial in the field of substance abuse in Georgia, the country, by the way, and its conduct was challenging. So now if that was an editor, a reviewer, a reader, myself, just looking at that, I was thinking, wait a minute, is this publication going to be about the failures of a clinical trial? Is it going to be about the challenges? And you read the rest of that paragraph, the whole notion of participation is research was difficult. The principle of randomization, all these things started to drive home a message that this randomized trial was very challenged. So I say, okay, well, then I read the next paragraph, the second paragraph, the first sentence. In this randomized controlled trial, participants assigned to a comprehensive intervention that paired behavioral treatment with naltrexone were significantly more likely than usual care patients to enter detoxification and naltrexone treatment and provide significantly more opioid negative urine samples. Oh, okay, that actually is the result of the RCT, of the clinical trial, but that sentence is so long. By the time I got to the end of it, I forgot where I was going with it. So my recommendation for strength, now this was published, of course, the news was important, but I wonder how many times people have to reread what was written there to get the main message. Here's what I would have done with it. Again, searching for a sentence that's less than 22 words, very clearly, very accessible, right up front, first sentence. A randomized controlled trial found that behavior treatment plus naltrexone significantly reduced addiction to heroin over behavioral treatment alone. This is the idea I'm promoting, that you lead with a very accessible, very clear, very short sentence. That's the message. And then back that up with supporting sentences. This is an example of leading with what are kind of the limitations, or maybe leading with what was a secondary point about the challenges of trials, should be saved for later if you want the message to drive home. Because the impact of this study, the importance of this study was that the clinical trial worked. The promise of the title, the promise of what the study was, the main objective and design is summarized in the first sentence. Okay. Here's another example of a first sentence. This is the first time a study achieved a national survey of oral health among 6 to 12-year-old school children in Bhutan, finding a high level of caries with lower levels among children with older children compared to younger children, among urban compared to rural children. I hope you're getting the idea. This is long. It's 46 words. There's really 4 different points. What should you be doing? You should be breaking this into 3 to 4 sentences, 1 point per sentence. Or even better, where I'm going with this could be broken into separate paragraphs. And I'm making the transition to the not only that ideas. So in other words, it might be hard to let go of something, but pick one of these to be your mission accomplished. Pick one finding that you'll really stand behind, that you support. Again, if people read this, they may not get everything, and then break the others into paragraphs of the other findings that you want to share. Okay, so again, another theme I've been working in is think of the poor, tired reading medical residents falling asleep, told they need to read, like dental residents, reading this, falling asleep, don't make it hard for them to keep reading and rereading to find your message. So if the mission accomplished is, dear reader, if you read this first sentence, you can go to sleep because that's the main point. But if you're still awake, if you're still with me, now I have some other things I would like to tell you. Okay, so we get to the not only that. This should be a relief in some way. That if I told you most readers are only going to read that first sentence or even the first paragraph, then you should say, well, then whatever I say in whatever order from this point, I don't have to worry about too much about how to rearrange it. Just pick the secondary findings and go through them one at a time. I even start this paragraph or this section of paragraphs. Again, it might disappear later in editing, but I remind myself where I'm going. I'll lead it with the study also found, and then I'll just throw out some things. This is often where you make comparisons to the global literature. You'll say, this finding was similar to what they found in Armenia, or contrasting. You can say, unlike several studies conducted in Canada, we did not find this association.
Hey, Professor,
Yes.
we do have a question.
Yeah.
What is your recommendation for adjusting this strategy if the results are neutral or negative?
Whoa, that's a really, really good question. Writing a randomized trial or a study that was negative or no difference, that to me is a challenge, actually. My advice is you still grab the bull by the horns and say that as your mission accomplished. So for example, I've done several clinical behavioral interventions, randomized behavioral interventions that did not show an improvement in risk behavior. There is a temptation to say, well, why don't I focus on something a little bit more positive, a little bit more interesting, a little, an association in the baseline or secondary finding. The problem is if you say the design is a RCT, the reader will really be looking for the result of that RCT. They will comb your paper quickly and see, is it clear whether this worked or not? And so if you're hiding it behind some secondary finding, you might actually irritate them. And even more importantly, you'll irritate an editor or the reviewers. The other thing to remember is that if it's a randomized clinical trial, then you're supposed to follow the consort guidelines that very clearly lay out what the title is, what the results section will be, and where they can find this. So in those situations, you're not going to be able to avoid it. So I say embrace it, grab the bull by the horns. And when I've encountered that, my first sentence was actually, it was something like, contrary to what we hoped and expected, our randomized trial found no difference between the novel intervention and control. And while that sounds like a disappointment, your reader will thank you to say, I'm glad that I know upfront. I'm not going to repeat this study, or I'm not going to need, this is evidence that weighs against changing the clinical practice at this point in time. Lastly, I'll say that negative findings, and this scientifically, negative findings are actually as important as positive findings. And it's scientifically rigorous to report them as such. But I know as human beings, as people who poured their heart into a study testing a hypothesis that they were really excited about and really went to, it's difficult and it's so deflating. And then on top of it, it's not only is it demoralizing to have to write it in some ways, readers don't like to read it as much either. They kind of will pass by it. And that includes editors and reviewers, unfortunately. So to try to counterbalance this, I also recommend that in the cover letter to the editor, which is if you remember, that's one of the 4 places that you make your message very clear: title, last sentence of the abstract, first sentence of the discussion, cover letter to the editor. Make it clear that you understand that it's important to publish negative findings, that scientifically it's as rigorous to report no significant difference when you thought there would be one, or a negative finding in a controlled trial. Remind them of that, and that may help. Sorry, that was a long answer to that question. My basic answer is don't shy away from it. Embrace it. If that's your main objective, is that's the design of the study, say so upfront. Okay. So the last point on last line on this slide that I'm showing, don't simply repeat results. This is kind of the trap of this format I'm saying, that you march through secondary findings. But what you want to avoid is simply saying the result over again. That will just feel like you're repeating what you said in the results section without saying the meaning of it. I'll get some techniques on how to avoid that in a moment. So how many of these things? Well, 3 additional findings and their meaning and their position in the literature, I think, is enough. So if you had your mission accomplished, your paragraph, your main finding well supported, 2 or 3 other findings is probably enough. Of course, it depends on your objectives of it. Okay, so here's some examples of things that I would choose to show. They are often the secondary objectives. If you had aim number 1, protocols almost always have at least 3 aims: specific aim 1, 2, and 3. If this is the paper that you're going to show all of them, then those would be your secondary findings. Here's an example. This study also measured opinions on sensitive issues surrounding unplanned pregnancy. So I think the main point of this paper was what proportion of women had unwanted pregnancies. Then the next one was actually delving into some of the controversies around abortion and what people are, controversies around dealing with unplanned pregnancies. This is my favorite, actually. No, this is not my favorite. The next one is my favorite. This one is similar to the one that came up. Unexpected negative results. So again, if your objective number 1 was the main hypothesis, lead with it. But sometimes secondary findings you'll find are unexpected and they pop out. I like these a lot because the unexpected, it makes it feel like, well, this is truly new investigation. This is true research where you're finding something new or you're challenging conventional wisdom. That somehow lends more importance to publishing these things. So unexpected things like negative findings that you expected but did not find, or positive findings that were unexpected, or ones that contradict the literature, I think are fun to latch onto. I admit, though, it takes confidence in yourself. If you're going to contradict what most other researchers are finding, you're going to be nervous. But just take it as this. We're calling it as we see it, and we're being honest. Okay, unexpected negative results. The study did not find younger women more vulnerable to unplanned pregnancy, although they account for a large number of births in Bhutan. So negative findings that things that were not associated but you expected are worth saying as a not only that paragraph. And here's an example of findings that contradict other studies. And if I find this, I'll lead with contrary to expectation, or contrary to what many studies around the world have shown. So you're telling the reader, I know, this is not what we expected. This is different. We did not find an association between pre-existing herpes 2 infection and subsequent HIV seroconversion. If you're in the HIV world, you know that does contradict what you would expect to find. Okay.
Professor?
Again, yeah.
All right. Some journals say summarize your results in the first paragraph. What do you recommend for such cases?
Yeah, I feel that's in line with what I'm recommending. That summarizing the results, think clearly on the main result. I don't think that a journal would be asking you to summarize every significant finding that you found in your study. Again, that I would say set aside for the not only that paragraphs. I think when they're saying summarize your main results, they really are zeroing in on your mission. Now, if it's a randomized controlled trial, that is clearly whether that trial worked or not. Did the intervention do better than the control? Any secondary findings is very secondary, and I don't think they were saying, and what were some of the baseline correlations that you found? That's not what they're saying. If you set it up that we'll talk about this in the introduction, but if you set it up that you're saying, there's an important gap in the literature that needs to be filled, then it's that gap that you're summarizing, not these unexpected and secondary findings. So I feel that they are really telling you, don't summarize the entire study in that first paragraph. Summarize your main message. Again, yeah. Also remember that the abstract probably is also a summary of secondary findings as well, that you are maybe saying all the significant findings or several of the important ones. So this first paragraph should be the take-home message. And, you know, as a reviewer and an editor of different journals, cramming too many findings right up front in that first paragraph is very distracting. Okay, so my recommendation is stick to the message. Any other questions?
Nope, not for now.
Okay, the next section, the mea culpa. If anyone's Catholic, they'll know what I mean by that, that this is sort of the confessional. This is sort of where you're coming forward and very clearly saying, here are the biases of our study. Here are the potential challenges of our study. And if you've read any paper, you probably know it begins with some sentence like this. We recognize limitations of our study. I think an even more a common one, I don't know if it's more common, but you can tell where they're going with it when this sentence begins. All studies are subject to potential biases and limitations. So they're sort of saying, look, this is true of every study, not just us. But you'll see, it begins something like this. We recognize limitations of our study. So what you're doing here is you're confessing your sins in order to get forgiveness for these sins, right? So let me remind you, no study is without potential bias. And I think that's why this paragraph often begins by saying this, no study is without potential limitations. So is yours. No study is perfectly executed. You'll have challenges in the implementation, right? So this strategy, it's both tactical and scientific. It's scientific because it's your job to point out the potential limitations. No studies without bias. The scientific process is to think through what are the potential biases. Are they strong? Are they affecting our results? How could we mitigate them? What would be the next experiment that we need to do to check that? That's very scientific. That's part of the process, and that's your duty as a writer to do this. But it's also psychological. In other words, pointing out the biggest flaws of your study disarms your critics. Think of a reviewer that's, they're assigned by the journal to read the paper, they're evaluating its merits, and they almost feel tasked with finding the fatal flaw. And they're thinking, as they're reading along, they're probably going, oh, I bet I know what they did wrong here. I bet they didn't account for something. I bet they have some sort of error that they've forgotten. And then they get to your third paragraph or your next to last paragraph of the discussion, and you say, here's what is the biggest flaw of this study. You've taken away their weapon. And now you've opened the door to say, okay, yes, we recognize this very thing that you were going to criticize. And here's how we think we can mitigate this, or here's why we still believe our results. Okay, so it's the way to forgiveness. It opens the door to say, what are the strengths of the study that may offset this? Okay.
Professor?
Yes.
Sorry, we have another question. Is it enough to mention potential bias or essential to quantify or evaluate the potential impact on the results?
Yeah. Yes, if you can. That, if you can do something like sensitivity analyses or, modeling in some way the impact of missing data, imputation, something like this. If you can do that, that makes a very compelling case that, you imputated missing data and your main finding holds, or you stratified, in a manner that eliminated a potential bias or confounder, or did a sub-analyses. Those are great if you can do them. I would say most of the time you're not able to necessarily do them. So you might simply just have to say, look, we like social desirability response bias is typical in a lot of studies, particularly about behavior and very sensitive topics, that people in interviews will tend to underreport stigmatized behaviors. Maybe you can model that, maybe you have some information, but most of the time you won't. But you do still have to acknowledge it. And what you'll often be saying is, well, if there's underreporting of these stigmatized behaviors, the problem we're highlighting might even be worse. And what you're sort of saying there is we recognize the bias and we think we know the likely direction that that bias will have. So the hierarchy would be if you can do some sort of sensitivity analysis or imputation, for example, that's great. It's very compelling. It's a lot of work, though. So be ready to do it if you were going to go that route. Most of the time, you point to the bias, say how strong it might be, and what the likely direction of that bias is. And any sort of statement, either corroborating with other studies or within your data, that your main finding would still be valid. Some biases and limitations, there's absolutely nothing you can do about. I think I'll have an example, but you say it, and it's sort of like, yes, this is a problem, and hopefully by acknowledging it, you sort of lend more credibility to your study because you see it, you're aware of it, and it might not be you're not the only one who has this problem. So yeah, yeah, in fact, this is kind of where I was going with the next. If you can explain the likely size of the bias, if you can explain the likely direction of this bias, and if you can explain any steps you did to mitigate these biases, and what you're doing is making an argument that your main message, your main conclusion holds. And as I said, start with the worst possible bias. Put that up front. I know this may be against human nature, right? If you sort of say, okay, I know I'm supposed to go through a list of all the potential biases. Let me start with some mild ones that everybody will say, yeah, no problem, and bury the big one deep inside the middle of this paragraph. Don't do that because they're waiting for the gotcha moment, you know. And if you don't say it up front, they're gonna be like, I think you're trying to hide this, and therefore I have more doubts about what you're saying. Grab the biggest flaw, the potential biggest bias, biggest challenge right up front. Okay.
Hey, Professor, I'm
Yes.
sorry. We still have, I think, 2 questions maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Can we also provide the strengths of the study before the limitations of the study?
Absolutely. That's actually a very good idea. In my format, I tend to put the strengths up in that first paragraph to bolster the main message conclusion. But what you're saying is a very good writing technique. You can either, I've seen it done in a couple ways. You can either sort of say in the paragraph, there are many strengths and weaknesses that we wish to highlight. And then you can, the style of that paragraph toggles back and forth between strengths and limitations. That's one way of doing it. The other way is, as you said, you can sort of say, we wish to highlight several strengths of our study. And you can talk about, the sample size, the uniqueness of the population, the rigor of the sampling methodology, the biological mechanism behind your conclusion. That's great. And then the style then segues to, nonetheless, there are several limitations that need to be recognized. That's a very good writing style. I'm glad you said that.
Sorry, we have follow-up questions to this.
Yeah.
I would imagine that it is important that the limitations are not fundamental, otherwise the study itself may not be found credible. Would this be correct?
Well, that's correct. I mean, that is part of the scientific method that if in looking at the limitations, you yourself as the researcher have doubts about the conclusion, that really says something. So to be intellectually honest and think through, are these fatal flaws? Then you may be confronted with, again, this happens in research, that you can't stand behind the conclusions, and you definitely should not. It actually is your job to decide that. When that happens, if in other words, this is different than a negative study. You can have a perfectly executed randomized controlled trial, or near perfect. I'm saying nothing's perfect. Near perfectly designed, executed, and analyzed, and there's a negative finding that there's no difference in the intervention versus control. That's very scientific and that's good, and you can stand by it. And you can say this is evidence against the hypothesis being, the alternative hypothesis. That's different from, saying the measurements were so biased, the responses were missing on more than half the data. The loss to follow-up was so severe that we think those that, acquired disease never came back again. If these are true, then you've hit upon that the study is fatally flawed. Perhaps you can salvage it in a lessons learned paper on challenges to follow up, these things that it can be done, but you do have to be honest that if it is fatally flawed, you should be the one to find it first. Think of the contrary. If you go ahead and stand by it and publish it, that's in the record forever, as long as civilization and humanity lasts. You've now gone on record as saying this, and it might be held as, no, this study was flawed, and this researcher's now questioned. So, yeah, that it could be a good thing if you find it fatally flawed.
Okay, I'm sorry. There is one person that is raising their hand. I want to make sure
Oh, yeah,
that
please,
that's
please.
not an accident. Armand, I'm going to allow you to talk. If you would like to ask a question, your hand's raised. That might be by accident. Okay. All right, that
No.
might be an accident.
No, he's going to speak. He's going to speak.
Yeah, sorry, no, you can just continue. I'm listening. I raised the hand before. It does now.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Can you lower it? Lower it?
It's okay. I'll lower it for him. It's okay.
Oh,
Okay.
there we go.
All right. There's no problem. Okay, but there is one more question now. How will writing the discussion vary among superiority, non-inferiority, and equivalence trials?
Yeah, again, I think the model can still fit that. The main hypothesis is that this new intervention is no worse than the standard of care. And I guess what you're trying to bolster would be something like, but it's easier. It's can be implemented in limited resource settings. It has, greater appeal to different subgroups of the population. So you're still leading with, great. We set out as one of the potential outcomes is this new intervention could be non-inferior to another or the standard of care. And there you might be bolstering why the message now is this new intervention should be seriously considered. Maybe it's it's the simplicity of delivery, the cost is lower, it requires fewer staff time, fewer interactions, less biological specimens collected. Maybe it's more cost effective, although cost effectiveness might be its own paper onto itself. But again, lead with the mission accomplished, which is generally going to be your main hypothesis, your main outcome, the thing that the study was designed upon. Yeah, if you say, well, I'm not publishing the main outcome of that non-equivalency, I'm publishing something else, then that becomes something totally different. You're sort of doing a secondary analysis of either the baseline or follow-up data in some way. Yeah.
All right, thank you. That's all the questions right now.
Okay, cool. All right, here's an example of a limitations paragraph. And what I want to highlight here is the technique of using first, second, third, fourth, lastly. I guess what I'm telling my mentees and students when they say, well, how many limitations do I need to point out? And I'm saying, well, if I press you, I'm sure you could find at least 3 and arrange them in the order of the most important, second and third. Perhaps there's even more that you could find. Again, for this idea of the reader will not be lost if you make it easy for them. So here we say, we recognize limitations of our study, first, second, third, fourth, lastly. This pattern it leads the reader quickly through the limitations section. It doesn't, they don't have to keep reading and rereading. They're not looking for that gotcha moment if they're sort of going, okay, they've recognized these limitations. So look for at least 3 when you're writing up the limitations section. When I see a paper that has more than 3, I mean, by the time you get to the 4th possible limitation, you're probably in the realm of this isn't that serious, or it's something that's true of any such study. When I see them, I think a reviewer found a limitation. When the manuscript was submitted, it went through peer review, and one of the reviewers found something that wasn't mentioned. So in the revision, the writer goes back and says, 4th, lastly, and adds those limitations. Okay. Okay. Now, again, as I said, the mea culpa, or the limitations paragraph, is your moment of getting forgiveness or redemption. So look for ways that, say the bias very clearly, without hedging your bet. Say, this is a serious potential bias of our study. Then in the next, and don't in the same sentence undo it and sort of say, but there's reasons why. Say it clearly first, and then the next sentence might say why you believe it's not fatally flawed. You can then do these things like what you did to try to address the bias in the study design or analysis. This is where you can bring other evidence, either from other studies or your own study, that aren't likely to change the primary conclusion. Again, it's a lot of work. I'm not saying you should do this every time, but some sort of sensitivity analysis, either formal or informal, some sort of imputation is possible if missing is a serious bias. You can also sort of say, look, this challenge is not unique to our study. Future studies will need to address this. I mean, a common one is, it's almost a cliche to say, if your study is cross-sectional, you cannot determine causality in a cross-sectional study. Everybody who's ever done, Epi 101 knows this, and it's always true. What you might suggest then, at least it segues to suggesting that the finding is strong enough, the association is strong enough in our study that this should be investigated in longitudinal studies, or this may be a point of intervention in a future trial. So that's the idea. Okay. What are some examples? This one comes up all the time. We recognize limitations of our study. First, the sample size was small. That's technically can be true of any study, right? That even the smallest possible difference could be statistically significant if the study sample size is huge. Or you could, and the flip side of that is large effects can be found in relatively small sample sizes. So in some level, this is always going to be true. Why mention it? Well, it might be something that a reviewer pointed out. That, well, you only had 112 participants. That sounds like a small sample size. So if it is particularly small and you're worried about it, definitely make it a mea culpa. Definitely put it in your results, and then in your discussion section with limitations. But then you might say something that might mitigate it, like the strength of the association, for example. Another one that I've used when this comes up, because it often does. However, the sample size was not chosen based on a power analysis, since this research was primarily a feasibility study. You can almost always circle back to, was this sample size to test only a single hypothesis that had a sample size, or was this a secondary finding, or was this part of a study that wasn't based on a single hypothesis? Let me ask this, what people think. Your protocols that you've written will definitely have spent some time writing a sample size calculation. This is another stressful time for mentees and students, is writing this very careful sample size calculation. So it's usually in a protocol. Do you have to put it in your manuscript? Any answers? I don't know if people are saying yes or no in the chat.
Let's see. Nothing yet. One person says no.
I agree with that.
And one person says no, and one person said yes.
Okay. I would agree by and large with the no. Don't do this. My reasons for not doing this is it's an easy target. that, I mean, you have to include it in a protocol because you don't want to say, I'm going to run this study and not make a case that you're going to find something. But once the study is done, a lot of these findings were not part of that guess. In other words, the sample size is based on a guess, based on a lot of assumptions. Now you show that you're showing in your manuscript that none of these assumptions were actually true, or it was something completely different. And there's nothing you can do about it. So unless there are exceptions, of course, but I would avoid it if possible because it will always be criticized. If you've ever submitted a protocol to the CDC, they almost always criticize the sample size estimate. It's a guess. It's an estimation. It's not a calculation. There are exceptions. One exception is the consort for a clinical trial does require it. So you will have to do it there. Another exception is if there truly was a single hypothesis and your study was negative, that is going to prompt a reviewer to say, well, was this a problem of sample size? So you won't be able to avoid it if a reviewer asks for it. And you won't be able to avoid it if it's a randomized clinical trial.
Somebody has a question on that. They've said,
Yeah.
But shouldn't you make it clear that you did a sample size calculation?
Well, in other words, maybe. So in your methods section, you're saying something like, we did a cross-sectional survey to measure HIV prevalence and associated risk factors of infection. The study was designed to recruit 500 female sex workers. I'm okay stopping there, but you may encounter a reviewer that will say, and that 500 was because, in which case I would then provide it. Should you head the criticism off at the pass and there say it? I would say if you met that sample size, then you're playing to a strength. In other words, if you recruited 504 female sex workers, then you can say an a priori sample size provided 95% confidence that prevalence would be estimated at 12% plus or minus 3% in a sample of 500 female sex workers. Fine. But now, what if you fell far short of that? And another thing, what if prevalence was not 10%, but 3%? Now you've sort of set yourself up for criticism. So I would say think very carefully about that. I would also say that a lot of observational studies have a sort of pretty standard sample size, so you probably will not get questioned at all on it. Good question, though.
Oh, wow. We have 3 more questions.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
Go for it.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered that or if I feel like I'm being a little bit sneaky. If you can stand by it, then fine. It sounds like a strength. But if you're going to be confronted with none of your assumptions held and you didn't make the sample size and it doesn't matter to your main point, I would say probably not. Okay, what are the other questions?
Okay, there's 4 now. How will the reviewer assess the accuracy of your calculation in this case? Doesn't this make falsifying data easier?
A sample size estimation that you do before you do a study is not a data analysis. In other words, a sample size calculation are guesses. You're gonna say we assume that the outcome will have this prevalence. We assume that the predictor will have this prevalence. We assume that the association will be this strong. We will say, let's get 80% power to find such a thing, and let's give ourselves a 5% type 1 error possibility. Those are entirely guesses. And anybody can say, I don't like those guesses. I guess it's something else. That is what a sample size estimation is. When you do a study and say, we found prevalence to be 10% with a 95% confidence interval ranging from 7% to 12%, and we found that having a prior history of an STD has an odds ratio of 1.78 with the 95% confidence interval of this. Those are talking about the validity and accuracy of the data that you collected. Now, or I should give an example. We found prevalence to be 3% with a margin of error going from with a 95% confidence of 1 to 5%. So now you're saying, well, your sample size said it was going to be 10%, and it turns out it's 3%. It has nothing to do with the accuracy or precision of what you did measure in your study. So I feel there's often a conflation between what is data that you found, the validity and accuracy of those data, the precision of the estimates of those data, and the potential biases in those data, and a sample size calculation. Again, a sample size calculation is a guess. It's an assumption that you need to do to plan your study. Can we do this study with 70 people, or do we need 700 people? So if you put it out there and your assumptions were wrong, that's life. You're doing the study to measure prevalence among female sex workers because you don't know it. It turns out you were wildly overestimating it based on some other study done somewhere else. Or you are arbitrarily picking 80% power and a 95% significance level. Equivalent studies do a different power, for example. So don't conflate your pre-study sample size guess with the accuracy of the data that you collected. I feel like I'm on a high horse here. Does that make sense to people?
I will go ahead and give you another question that's a good follow-up to that one, I think. When Elizabeth says, I feel like this is splitting hairs, but would it be more appropriate to call the sample size in the protocol as sample size estimation rather than sample size calculation? That would reduce the confusion and remove its relevance to the study.
That's an excellent idea. And if you were told by your mentor or co-authors you should include it, if you were told by a peer reviewer that you should include it, and the assumptions of the estimation, yes, very good word. The assumptions of the estimation are very different than the actual data. Then you can point that out. You can say, HIV prevalence among female sex workers was wonderfully lower than we expected. And this is good news. We expected in our sample size calculation, we expected 10%, turned out to be 3%. Sorry, did I say calculation? Estimation. That recommendation is very good. It is an estimation. It is a guess. Yeah.
Ali asks, online calculators consider random sampling. Many surveys are non-random. Which owner analysis package do you recommend as standard popular?
That's a good one. It's funny, when I teach a course in sample size estimation and, as part of a protocol design, the technology just wonderfully changed over the course of my career. I used to do it by hand using plugging in a formula. And then, or there was tables and books that you could use. Then in rapid succession, the online calculators became so wonderfully user-friendly. I'll confess to you a secret. Now I use ChatGPT. I just feed in the assumptions and it wonderfully, produces a sample size estimation. So I guess I'm gonna say if I were to do it myself, I use ChatGPT or one of the AI tools, and they are continually getting better. The caveat, of course, is you still have to feed it your assumptions. You still have to tell the robots, I'm assuming a prevalence of 10%. I want 80% power. I need a 5% margin, type 1 error. And it's a simple random sample. Actually, I strayed from the original question. It was something about it assumes a simple random sample. If randomization is involved, it can be a complex random sample where you might have cluster randomization or multi-stage randomization, in which case you can ask an online calculator and ChatGPT to do that for you, but you have yet another assumption. You have to say, I guess there'll be an interclass correlation of 0.15. So it's once again, who knows, but that's another assumption and could be wrong. If it's a non-random sample, if it's a convenient sample, then you're kind of in this realm of something we do all the time, but it's not technically correct. We kind of just go on the assumption that it mirrors a simple random sample. So like if your sample was, we consecutively recruited people we saw in these hotspots. There's not too much you can do about that. It's not really random, but we make a basic assumption that it'll largely behave as a random sample. You might be a little bit fancier and say we use the hotspot location as a cluster, and we have a design effect of 2 or an interclass correlation of 0.15 or whatever. But again, it is an assumption. Now I'm totally unsure if I've answered the question. Does that make sense? Did I answer it? Somewhere in that mix?
Well, nothing to the contrary says that. I have 3 more questions. I don't know if we want to just hold off for now until you do more, or I could keep asking them for you.
Let's do it. Let's do it. I love the interaction. It's
Okay.
productive.
I've been ignoring this one for a while because people were asking very similar questions. I'm sorry, Friedman. Does not publishing the negative results or being silent of a non-equivalence design, especially when the design may have some contribution to why the results is that way, not be a reporting bias?
The answer is, well, it's wrong not to publish it. Scientific integrity demands that you should publish it. And it's unfortunate it's harder to publish. It's harder to write, and it's harder to get accepted. I think, if you've ever done a meta-analysis or a systematic literature review, there is a bias in publication towards positive findings, things that find an association rather than not finding an association. It's so great that any meta-analysis has to do some sort of analysis of how severe that bias is. I think the usual image you see is a funnel graph that, the sample size and finding makes this sort of funnel shape, that the larger the sample size that comes to a point, the smaller the sample size, it can vary on the other end of it. The funnel graph shows all those below the line of finding being cut off. And so that shape alone tells you that there's a lot of publication bias against a negative study. So the answer is, I would say, as a researcher, you're ethically obligated to publish it. And you're ethically obligated to come clean that it is a negative study, and you recognize the errors, you recognize potential biases yourself, and put it out there. I admit, though, it's really much harder to write it, and it's much harder to get it accepted because of this publication bias. Yeah.
Next question is from Maria. Doesn't level of significance in the sample size calculation, which determines the accuracy of results, should we mention the parameters of significance and power?
So
sorry.
In the sample size calculation or estimation, you're still doing what is the margin of error on your guess, right? You're saying we guess that prevalence is 10%, and we'll accept a margin of error of plus or minus 5%, let's say, or plus or minus 3%. It's kind of weird to say what's the accuracy of my guess in the absence of any data whatsoever. That a priori guess you've made actually has nothing to do with what you finally get. In other words, if you guessed right, it's 10%, that might actually be a coincidence. And the accuracy of that, first of all, there's precision and there's accuracy. The accuracy of that depends on what kind of biases you have. Like, for example, women who knew they were living with HIV decided not to be in your study, then you're going to underestimate, and it's inaccurate of the population. That has nothing to do with your sample size calculation at all. That's a potential bias. The precision, which you sort of set out in saying we accept a precision of a plus or minus 1 or 2%, and we need a sample size. Again, it would only have happened to be exactly what you guessed if you were exactly right in your guess. So that's the precision around it. So if it turns out your estimate was correct, it was 10%, it probably will be close to your margin of error that you guessed. But again, if it's 3%, it has nothing to do with it. The precision around the 3%, whether it's goes from +1 to +5 around the 3%, has nothing to do with your guess anymore. Your guess was completely wrong. So again, it's conflating data with an estimation, with a guess. What you get in your study is what you observe in the real world. It's not guess, it's data. What you guess and what you want are based on assumptions.
Once we collect data, is it advisable to do a power analysis and report the power for all studies or only for negative results?
You will probably be asked by reviewers to do it for negative results. Because there what you're looking for, I don't want to say this wrong, but I think it's a type 2 error that there isn't. The type 1 error is you say there's association and there's not really one. The type 2 error is you say there's no association, but one actually does exist. And that then begs the question, well, did you not find it because you didn't have enough participants? So there is a role for a power analysis in a negative study that isn't really relevant to a positive study and a type 1 error. So I'd say yes, for the most part, you might be asked to do it. And if you want to grab the bull by the horns, you could do it upfront with the main submission. You would be saying, we did not find an association that we expected to find. Therefore, we did a power analysis to see what sample size might have found the finding. But there's a few catches to this. One caveat is, all right, you're saying there was no significant association, but which side of the bar did your observation fall? In other words, if you said we expect to see an odds ratio we powered the study to find an odds ratio of 2, and the odds ratio was a non-significant 1.5. Yeah, then you could do a power analysis and say, in order for 1.5 to achieve significance, we would have had to have twice as many subjects or something like participants. But what if it falls on the preventive side, the opposite direction, and it's 0.75 in the opposite direction? Then a power analysis, you can't possibly make that flip. Power analysis is irrelevant if it's in the opposite direction of what you expected to find. So in other words, you would just be saying it'll definitely be not what we found if we had 10,000 people in the study. So you have to think carefully through what exactly did you observe and what exactly is a power analysis going to tell you. Yeah, we've dug into this one quite a bit, haven't we? It sounds like people are encountering this quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you still have 3 more questions now too, so seems to be a popular topic.
Yeah.
Do you want me to keep asking them?
Sure.
Okay.
Let's do it.
All right. What is your opinion regarding using parametric hypothesis tests to non-random samples?
I'm worried that this is also conflating something. So hypothesis testing is simply saying our observation is not random. So if it's not random, it could be the result of bias, or it could be the result of a true effect going on there. So a non-parametric test being used to calculate a sample size still has assumptions on how different the two groups are going to be. Parametric may have to make an assumption that it's, a mean, these follow normal distributions and we're looking at a mean difference, or that the parameter of interest, such as an odds ratio or relative risk, is going to follow a distribution. Whereas you're saying, no, it's not going to work that way. It's going to be non-parametric, like a Likert scale, for example. Those are generally not parametric. You're still making assumptions about how the variables are distributed and how different they are from each other. So it doesn't avoid that same idea that the sample size is an estimation, is a guess. So it doesn't help you at all.
How do you mention the sample size estimation for secondary data analysis, like the data from a health program?
Yeah, no, that's a good question because it's a good example of why it's irrelevant. That if the sample size has to be based on an assumption about a particular hypothesis. Now you're saying, forget that hypothesis. We explored the data to look at a whole bunch of other things. Then your sample size calculation had nothing to do with those other things. It wasn't the same outcome. It wasn't the same predictors. It wasn't the same distribution. It wasn't the same effect size. So if you're doing a secondary analysis on findings that were not what the sample size is based on, then the sample size estimation is completely irrelevant.
Awesome. Okay, there's one last question for now. All right. Is it possible to connect early career researchers to mentor for more follow-up?
In this format we're doing now?
I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, there are other opportunities. So one is I don't know if it's my place to say this, but we are planning an in-person workshop somewhere around July to September. So I assume there might be some application process for members. Malene, I don't know if I'm misspeaking or prematurely speaking, but that's one opportunity. What I'm giving you now are actually parts of the slides of University of California, San Francisco's workshop. That also has an application process. There's no charge. It's free. We review applicants. You can look on UCSF's website. It's called ITAPS, International Traineeship in AIDS Prevention Studies. It's funded by NIH for HIV research. So we do sometimes take non-HIV applicants, but by and large, it's going to be geared towards that. Again, I'm not pitching or selling anything. It's no cost to anybody. We just take applicants and review them. Is that the question?
I'm not sure. I don't see any follow-up, so I'll just say yes for now.
Okay.
Go ahead and continue on while there's no questions.
Oh, a third scenario is actually what I'm doing at Moline right now. We have a training of trainers, and our trainees go forth as trained mentors to run workshops like this as well. And usually we support them in doing it. And I think what we've organized for this very series is in line with that, so we can organize other ones as well. Yeah.
I'm sorry, somebody just asked, please repeat those programs. Was that ITAPS?
Yes, ITAPS, International Traineeship in AIDS Prevention Studies. As I said, it's funded specifically for HIV research, but we can take a few other applicants as well. It's not, you don't have to pay for it. There's no tuition, there's no fees or anything. We're funded to do it. So it's open.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll see how far we get. Okay. Are things always a mea culpa? I feel like there's sometimes fake confessions, fake limitations. They're almost the cliches that you see all the time. And when I read them as a reviewer of manuscripts, if they lead with them or if they say too many of them, I'm thinking, this is true of any study ever done. I need to know what's particular to your study that might be a flaw. Let me give you some examples. This is my favorite one. We recognize limitations. First, sexual behavior was self-reported. I see this all the time. Anybody have any questions on this? What else would you go by? Are you going to videotape people, follow them around? Now, I know there's some PSA tests that can verify sexual intercourse at times, but come on. This is going to be self-reported. This could be said of anything, almost every study, 99.9% of studies on sexual behavior. External validity or representativeness. This one is often said, and maybe it's rightly so. If it's a non-random sample, convenience-based, then I think you probably should say this. And what you're saying is something like, we recognize that our study population may not be representative of the whole population or other cities or other countries, something like that. I would say it only if you really felt this was a particular limitation. Sometimes if you did do randomization or some sort of quasi-probability methodology, that becomes a strength rather than a limitation. Incomplete responses, that's often said, we recognize the limitation of some missing data. For my mind, it depends on how much is missing. If you look across your variables and see that it's something like 1 to 5% decline to answer, that's typical. It's probably not going to overturn your results. It's very typical of behavioral surveys. I don't see a problem in mentioning it at all. If you have some things that are on the order of 10, 15%, then that is a mea culpa. You can say a limitation is some key variables had a high level of missing data. And often these are the ones that are most stigmatized. That's where you should acknowledge it. Do you do a sensitivity analysis? Do you do imputation? Maybe. It's a lot of work. If it gets towards 20, 25%, then I think, yeah, this is probably pretty severe and you may have to do imputation or some sort of sensitivity analyses. But 90% of the time, surveys commonly have a couple percent missing, and that's fine. I wouldn't bother. We recognize the limitation. You cannot determine causality in cross-sectional studies. Sure, that's always true. You can say it if you want. I wouldn't lead with it, though. Also think very carefully, how much of a claim are you making of causality in your particular study before you say it? Associations are sometimes just used as associations. Targeting different groups with higher prevalence really isn't necessarily going to, targeting prevention interventions to reach particular groups with high prevalence is not the same as a causal mechanism that you might be claiming. Okay. This one I always find amusing is we recognize there are unmeasured or unknown confounders. That's always true. Anyone with imagination could say it. You're saying absolutely nothing unless you say what those confounders actually might be. And then you'll have to acknowledge that you failed to measure them, perhaps. Not enough money. I've seen this a few times. Do not say this. It is a limitation, of course, but it really is nothing you can do about or have a bearing on it. This is my favorite one that I was going to hold as an example. It said, we recognize limitations of our study. First, we lost 100 surveys for unknown reasons. I was reviewing this paper. I'm like, wow, that's so refreshingly honest. In other words, we know things like this happen. A box of completed paper questionnaires get lost. And what I felt was that these researchers were so honest in saying something that is very human and does happen. They acknowledge this up front, and they provide some analysis of whether this loss happened at random, and it appeared for all intents and purposes that it was a random loss of a chunk of surveys. So when they say something like this, I say, wow, these people are brutally honest. I now have more credibility in the other things that they're saying if they acknowledge this. Okay. So that's the mea culpas, the limitations. You don't end your paper on the limitations. Again, psychologically, you'll leave the reader with everything wrong with your study. What you end with is the way forward, or the kumbaya, I think we used to call it. So don't end on a negative note. Human nature likes the positive, and science is incremental improvement. You're doing your scientific process by saying, what is the next hypothesis? What is the next thing that needs to be done? And this is often the big picture or the way forward. It's one of the few times that you might depart a little bit from your own data. Now, the trajectory of the way forward stems from your data, but you might be proposing things for the first time that you haven't actually done yet. Okay, so the kumbaya is where you look for public health policy and clinical implications. So again, it's a cliche. I've seen this where people say the findings of our study have important policy implications. And then and then nothing more. You have to say, well, what policy implications do they have? And it should be linked to your data. So say what policy, say what clinical practice, highlight the data. Setting the research agenda is also a very good way to do the kumbaya. What's next? But again, it can't just be saying something like, here's a summary of our findings and limitations, more research is needed. If you say that, you should be very specific about what should be next and why. Do we need longitudinal studies to establish causality better? Is causality strong enough to do a randomized trial? Do we need to do a program evaluation that incorporates something about the findings? So don't just leave it at more research is needed. Say what exactly. The last paragraph, again, these may not stay in my final draft, but it gets me going, is I start in summary. So you say, you begin, it can be in conclusion, in summary, and that may actually be the heading of a separate section, for example. Another one I like to do is the segue from your limitations paragraph. So in other words, you've said, we recognize limitations of our study, first, second, third, fourth, last. And then the transition beginning of this final paragraph is, despite limitations, we've learned several things that can guide prevention programs. And then you recap there. So that's a transition. The transition may be part of the format of the journal. You have to look, follow the instructions of the journal. I think that was my rule number 3 or so. They will tell you that whether or not they want a specific heading that is this kumbaya. It might say, give us another section, you have discussion and then conclusions. And in my mind, this always threw me when this started to become more common practice, because I thought the discussion was the conclusions. But I think what they're saying is break it off and summarize the conclusions. And this is often the way forward. Other journals actually tell you to call it implications for public health or recommendations. And this be recommendations for clinical practice, public health, et cetera. So they break it off. And in this case, you can end the discussion section with the limitations because it immediately proceeds to the implications and recommendations. Okay, here's an example of one I really loved. It got the kumbaya final mission, final way forward paragraph in one. And it really added a lot of things that each of these findings that they're highlighting. So they're highlighting prevention programs for Jamaican adolescents. Each one of these was one of their findings. Starting at earlier age, they had the onset of sexual activity, focus on delaying sexual initiation, reducing multiple partnerships. That was another risk factor. Knowledge being low and HIV testing being low, and a very strong association of risk behavior and alcohol use. So you see what they're saying is craft the program very directly around their significant findings presented in the paper. Okay. More tips for discussion. Again, keep the interpretations close to your data. So don't speculate too far from causes that are not backed up by your data. Or if you are at that point where you're saying, I think another next step, a really good idea or something else to measure, make it clear that you're proposing a new hypothesis that's not necessarily the one that you had in your data presented. Here's another thing that I see all the time. It's fine to have it in a draft, but you'll have to change it. And it's this: don't introduce a new result for the first time in the discussion. So anything that you mention in the discussion has to first be said in the results. So if you recall, not every finding in the tables merits a whole sentence in your results section. But if it's something you mention in the discussion, then you definitely need to say it in the results. So keep it there, but go back and put a sentence in the results that says it. So if you sort of said, we need to increase STI testing because only 3% of female sex workers had been screened for an STD in the last year. And that's the first time you've said that figure. You've lost the reviewer. They're like, wait, what? I don't remember anything about STI testing. So that should be a flag. Okay, that's the first time I'm saying it. It is important after all. Go back and put it in the results. And if it's not in the table, you definitely have to put it in the table. And you may also say, oh yes, and we have the method section. We have to say that we asked them about STI testing. Okay, Do not promise future papers or studies. So you can suggest them. You can say the next important study to do is, but don't say, we've done that study, stay tuned for our publication. That will be the kiss of death, because the reviewer now will say, why are you bothering me with all of this when the real important thing you're holding back? So don't promise future studies or future paper publications. Don't say, stay tuned, wait for it. We've done this already. We'll show you soon. Okay, some style tips. Don't simply repeat results. Give their meaning, give their importance, give their position in the literature. So if you simply repeat results, it's going to sound repetitive and you're not contributing anything. So the technique here is give a citation to other findings that are similar or that they contrast with. Another way to prevent this problem is don't repeat numbers and statistics again. Don't give p-values, don't give odds ratios, don't give percentages to the same decimal places. This is where you round off or you use numbers. So I wanted to stress that definitely keep the same result figures, like the number of decimal places in the table, in the results, and in the abstract. Those need to be precise and exactly the same. In the discussion, use words. Think of yourself as speaking to a more wider audience, a lay audience. So this is where you do say nearly half had this effect, or more than 3 times the odds, rather than OR 3.12. Okay, so that's the exception to that rule of sticking to the same number of decimal places. Okay. Okay, introduction section. How are we for time? Yeah, okay, I think we can at least do this. Any questions, or should we just press on?
We have one question. This was from a little earlier. Can you advise us on some training sites where we can learn how to write successful grants?
Well, hopefully I answered some of that we're planning a workshop coming up, and UCSF does have it. But there are, I would imagine many universities have some sort of writing course. Ours developed out of our residents and fellows at our medical school to write up their findings. I'm assuming a lot of other medical schools around the world also do something like this. Whether it's open to people outside their institution might be the question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's the only question up there right now.
Okay, introduction. Now, we're coming near the end of everything, or at least certainly the end of the time we have together today. And suddenly we're in what usually is the beginning of the paper, the introduction. So if you remember the sequence that I'm following, the order of writing that keeps it flowing forward is tables and figures, story and numbers, results, story and words, discussion, meaning of those words, of those results. Now flip up to the introduction. Why not do the introduction first? To some degree, maybe you will be doing some of it first. If you're pulling a paper out of your dissertation or master's thesis, you will, of course, have something written, and you can adapt it at this point. But to me, to start with it, if you don't have something like that, to start with the introduction can be a big source of writer's block. And here's one reason why. You're summarizing the literature, right? That's where you're beginning with the introduction. The literature is so vast nowadays that you can't possibly keep up with everything. So you will continuously be summarizing new literature forever if you're starting with a blank page. The other thing to remember is a publication written on a new study is not the same as a dissertation. A dissertation, you are actually demonstrating profound knowledge of the field that you're working in. So it is comprehensive. You are meant to have gotten most of the highlights of the research that's been done. It's not in this publication on new data. It's not a book chapter. It's not a review paper, unless it is a review paper. In those situations, yes, the introduction to literature review is a big deal. But for a new publication, over time, this has truncated down to a much simpler format. So if you're beginning with a blank slate without your findings, the literature search is a procrastination tool. It prevents you from writing up your own results. The other caveat I've seen is starting with the literature review or starting with the introduction is a temptation for plagiarism, and maybe inadvertently so, that you're reading a paper and you're summarizing it. You're reading a paper, you're summarizing it, and eventually you're cutting and pasting different pieces of that summary. Maybe it's their mission accomplished statements, for example. And then you forget where it came from, or you don't modify it enough and it gets flagged as plagiarism. So doing that process of trying to synthesize everything, it can lead to cut and paste plagiarism. The other thing I want to pose to you is not to think of the introduction as a summary of everything that's known on the topic, but rather the introduction is to pose a question. It's to quickly get to what's not known in the literature. It's to quickly get to what an important gap in the literature is. Okay, so you do need to know some of the literature, but what you're pivoting on is not demonstrating expertise in everything ever done. You're pivoting on a gap that you want to fill. And it's easier to pivot on that point if it's something you've already answered. So in other words, if you've written your mission accomplished paragraph, your mission accomplished sentence, then convert that to the question. Make that the gap and get there quickly. So it's easier to pose a question that you've already answered. So doing the discussion before the introduction guarantees that you will pose a question you're going to answer. So think about it. If you start with the introduction, there is potentially infinite number of unanswered questions in the universe. You're not going to tackle them all. And if you're doing the literature, you're going to see a lot of questions. You're going to see a lot of gaps. But anything you mention that you don't answer now throws off the reader. They said, oh, I started reading your introduction that you posed these questions. You never answer them. Therefore, this paper doesn't work. So getting the discussion section done first guides you very quickly to the unanswered question. Yeah, so it gives you a filter to narrow down the literature that you need to summarize. In fact, I don't know if I posed this diagram before in the overview, but I do think of it as the introduction as a filter to get quickly to a question. And that sort of is a mirror image, so it's more of an hourglass figure, whoops, between the two. So if you think about it, the introduction, if you read an introduction, it usually starts with something that's a very big picture. It's usually, in public health, it's often the global epidemiology of your disease. Worldwide, big picture, big problem. But you're not going to talk about everywhere in the world. So the next paragraph and the next section gets very specifically to the topic at hand. It's a cliche, but you could start with 36 million people are living with HIV, but we're going to talk about HIV among adolescent girls and young women. So you're getting from the big picture to a more specific area. And then you're going even narrower. You're not going to say, we're not going to talk about everything about HIV among AGYW. There's a lot of things that are unknown, but a very important thing we do need to know is this question. And that becomes the ask. Then if you flip, so that's your main hypothesis. We are going to measure seeking STD screening among adolescent girls in Kenya. We don't know in the community how often this occurs. That's the gap. Therefore, we did this study. Then if you flip immediately to the introduction, it should say something like, we found that less than 5% of adolescent girls have been screened for STDs in the last year. It answers that question. And then the mirror image progresses a little further. You start talking about why this is important to AGYW sexual health. That's the specific issue. Then it becomes the bigger picture. What do we do next? We need to find innovative methods to deliver STI screening to this population. So that's the idea of why I say do the discussion first. Your introduction is not summarizing everything ever known about your disease. It's posing a salient question that you're going to answer for sure. Okay, as everything I do, I divide the introduction into the 4 sections. So it's that hourglass figure top part. So start with the big picture, the general situation, the global severity of this disease. Go quickly to the specific population, the specific area, the specific target that you're going to talk about, pivot on the gap in the knowledge of that specific situation. And then this last fourth part is sort of a transition. It's almost a sentence saying, therefore, we conducted a study to measure this, or we conducted a study to assess the effect of X on Y. Okay, I'll give you my favorite example. I was many years ago doing this course in Brazil. And I said, start with the big, big, big picture. And I swear that there's one student in the group that followed my instructions to the letter. I swear every single sentence in his manuscript was exactly 22 words. So whatever I said, he did exactly that. I said, think of the big, big, big picture. Start big. And he said, okay. In the year 1500, Conquistador Pedro Alvarez Cabral landed on the coast of South America. They're going, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's 500 years back. That might be too big a picture. Where exactly are you going with this? He says, well, what I'm going with is that the movement of people has contributed to the spread of infectious diseases. I go, okay, now I get where you're going with this. Okay. But what's the specific issue? Well, we did a study of long distance truck drivers in South America. And in the early epidemic of Africa, long distance truck drivers were implicated in the early spread of HIV. Okay, good, but what's the gap? Well, no study has done this in Latin America. So that is the gap. We need to assess the HIV-related risk behaviors of truck drivers, long distance truck drivers in Latin America. And that becomes the final part. We therefore conducted a survey of truck drivers at major crossroads in Brazil to measure the HIV risk while on the road. So if you get the outline, these 4 sentences are nearly enough to be the introduction. That each of them could be, if it's a very brief communication, you might just have a 4-sentence introduction. In a full research manuscript, they usually get fleshed out to a full paragraph. But each of these can be the topic sentence of the paragraph. Okay, so here, for example, my AP English teacher in high school would say a perfect English paragraph has a topic sentence as the start, then every sentence in that paragraph supports that. So topic sentence, the movement of people has historically contributed to the spread of infectious diseases. The next 3 to 5 supporting sentences support that. So couldn't resist the whole European contact with a vulnerable population 500 years ago, so that was worked in there, but brought it up to date with some of the trends in Latin America. Big picture, specific issue. Long distance truck drivers in particular have been identified as a potential vehicle for wider dissemination of HIV, followed by 3 to 5 supporting sentences. In this case, both in Africa and Asia, this has been shown. That transitions to the third part, which gets to the gap. Less is known about truck drivers in Latin America. And again, following sentences, 3 to 5 supporting sentences to say why that's an important question. The 4th part is the transitional one. We therefore conducted a study to fill this gap. In this case, we sampled the population of truck drivers passing through Salgueiro, a town in the interior of Northeast Brazil. This sentence might end right there, might be the last sentence of the previous paragraph, or it could be fleshed out a little bit more and be a full paragraph unto itself. Okay, so main points, get to your question quickly. Keep your eye on the gap and don't get distracted by an infinite amount of published literature that may or may not be relevant. So if you keep your eye on the gap in what you're filling, it should be a filter to the type of papers that you'll need to cite in the introduction. Don't describe everything on the topic. Again, work towards posing a salient question. And that question is, convert your mission accomplished into a question or an objective. The objective of our study was to measure X and Y, or we hypothesize X and Y. But don't say the results in your conclusion. I see this all the time that people start to talk about their own study. You have to have this stance as that you're writing the introduction as if you don't know what you're going to find. Now, I know this sounds like a little bit of a cheat, but the idea is you don't give the results in your introduction. You set up the question. Of course, you've done your analysis, you know where you're going with it, but don't weave it in. And for some reason, there's a temptation because if you're writing the introduction first, you want to tell them everything that's exciting. And that's another reason why not to do the introduction before you've done the discussion. Sometimes the introduction can be very short. Even those 4 sentences could work. I think some journals where the word count is very, very small, I think like Lancet is small, maybe the BMJs have low word counts. American Journal of Public Health can often be very short. That 1 paragraph is enough for an introduction. Many journals have a brief communication format as well, where the word count is very, very short, and this would be the type that might have just 4 sentences of introduction. I recommend looking at those because they're very gratifyingly quickly reviewed and quickly published if they like them. So if you have the possibility of doing a 1,200-word publication versus a 5,000-word publication, your chance is higher of being accepted. Okay, methods section. I think this is the home stretch for today or for this series of web lectures. Any questions come up on the introduction?
There are 2 right now. Would you recommend consulting a few recent review articles, systematic scoping, narrative, etc., to inform the introduction background?
Yes, yes, yes. Excellent point. A recent review article does a lot of the legwork for you. It is great to use them. That you can say a recent review, a recent meta-analysis found the following, and then cite that paper. That is a very excellent way of doing it. And reviews have become more rigorous and more numerous over time. So the opportunity to do that is there. And it also drives home the fact you don't have to do a review article for everything you write. Leave that to review articles. Excellent, excellent suggestion.
Okay, and the other one is, in discussion, an author needs to cite other studies that results are congruent. Don't these studies need to be in the introduction?
Sometimes, yeah. If a typical paper nowadays has somewhere like 20 to 30 references, half of those might be in the introduction and half of those may again be repeated in the discussion. So by and large, it probably is true that you will be citing those studies that are congruent, and those that might stand in contrast. So you can imagine, for example, if some studies say one thing and some studies say the opposite, that actually presents the perfect springboard to say this hasn't been thoroughly answered. We need additional data to corroborate the findings, or it hasn't been shown in a particular region to be true, but in some regions it is, some regions it's not. That sets up a good reason why you're doing your study and the question that you're posing. So by and large, yes, a lot of those citations and parallel, corroborating, contrasting references will be in the introduction and the discussion.
Awesome, thank you. No more questions right now.
Okay, the methods section. So I tend to leave this last, but I know that it's often one that is done early on because you can lift it from a protocol. You can lift it from your dissertation. But I think you'll know that if you do that, it is much bigger than is the expectation for a journal publication. It contains a lot more detail, a lot more steps, a lot more procedures than is required for, or even allowed, or even can fit in a typical publication on new data. So I tend to leave it last because it's often easier to build it up when it's smaller than to cut something like a whole 12-page protocol down to a page or two later. Another reason why I think I'll say this later, another reason I tend to leave it last is all the findings that you report guide what you need to say in the results, in the methods section. In other words, all the measures that end up in the final paper as being important are the ones you need to mention in your methods. If they're measures that you do not even show, then you do not include them in the methods. The flip side is also true. You suddenly realize there's a different type of analysis that you did that wasn't in the original protocol, or things that you did when in the analysis and interpretation might have been different, and then you would have forgotten to put them in if you plunked down your protocol. So two reasons. So if you do that, you probably will need to revisit to make sure it says what you did, aligns with what's shown, and cut out the things that are now irrelevant. Okay, when I was a grad student writing my first papers, my professors almost always said this. They said something like, the methods section should be a recipe for repeating your study. In other words, if someone read your methods section, they could reproduce your results. Sounds good, sounds rigorous. Have you heard this, or do you agree with that? I'm gonna be a little contrarian against my own pushback against my own professors. Not really, or only maybe for some people. If they're expert in your field, have done the type of study that you have done, they could probably reproduce it. But if they are not, then they couldn't. But so now ask yourself, if you read something way out of your field, does that mean you have absolutely no basis to judge whether it's a good paper or not? I mean, I'm not a laboratorian, but I read a lot of papers that offer new laboratory techniques. I couldn't read their method section and waltz into their lab and suddenly mix test tubes and reproduce exactly what they did. I would need a PhD in what they did. But they're providing me with enough information that someone familiar with the field can judge if their data support their conclusion, if their methods support the results they got, and their results support their conclusion. So it's not a protocol. It's not really a recipe to reproduce the study, but it does provide enough information for the average reader in the field to judge that the methods are appropriate to what they did and what they found and what they're interpreting. If they want to reproduce it, they can write to you and get a full copy of the protocol. Okay, so describe how the study was done with enough detail for the reader to judge whether the findings you report in your results support your conclusions. No more, no less. And I put this no more, no less because the full you will be striking things out of the full protocol that are irrelevant to the particular topic you're writing on. And you will have to look at the end, go back after you've written up everything and make sure everything that comes up in the results and discussion has a parallel in the methods section. So like I said before, never introduce a result for the first time in the discussion section. Go back and put it in the results. I also said, I don't know if I glossed over it, but I also said, and you probably will have to mention something about it in the methods section as well. Okay. Right. So again, echoing the points, if you don't want too much or too little. So even if you do write it early on, you'll have to review it in the end. Okay. And as everything, I divided up into 4 key areas. These are when I review a paper, these are 4 things I look for. You may have many more subheadings in the methods section than 4. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But what I'm looking for is front and center, a very clear description of the study design. Am I looking at an RCT? Am I looking at a cross-sectional study? Am I looking at a longitudinal cohort? Before I hear anything else, I need to get my head around what was the overall design. Then I need to say, okay, who were the participants? What was your eligibility criteria? Yes. Where were you gaining access? What was your sampling methodology? What were the steps for recruitment? Okay, now I know that it's a cross-sectional study of adult female sex workers. That's how you sampled them. What did you measure in this population? That's the third area. What are your key measurements? Behavioral, laboratory, etc. Then the last part, yeah, it's kind of, you have to do it. You have to say something about the analysis. It's frankly the most boring part in the entire world to write, because how many ways can you say you did a chi-square test and you did a confidence interval? It's a very standard way that these things get said. And I'll say up front that most editors will tell you that when they run the plagiarism check on your paper, lots of things in that statistical section get flagged because you can only say it so many ways, and they don't care. They don't care if it's the chi-square test was said this way before. So by and large, it's pretty standard. Just look how it was done and do something similar. Okay. There is an important piece that often is a fifth section. That's the ethical considerations. Sometimes that is put as the last part of the method section. Sometimes it has its own box to complete in the online submission. Sometimes it appears in the cover page of a publication. So look at the instructions where that goes. But somewhere you will have to have an ethical considerations page heading. Okay. Method sections is very much done with lots of subheadings. There'll be subheadings, sub-subheadings. It may go down several levels. Look at the journal instructions and look at an example to figure out how deep you have to go. Some methods may have no headings at all, but generally it's easier to break it into the subheadings and sub-subheadings. So again, if you do the minimum, this is what I would like to see is these 4 subheadings: overall study design, participants, measures, analysis. But you will see other papers want a lot more. They'll want the setting, the procedures, the statistical methods, laboratory methods, ethical considerations. Follow the instructions, follow an example. I think, I realize I only have like 1 or 2 minutes left. So I will try to press on a little bit. I can stay a little bit longer. I'll understand though if you have to run to something else. That overall study design, again, I'm looking for right up front, the first thing almost I want to see is a sentence that looks something like this. We conducted an X study on the effect of Y on Z in a population of W in Q country in year R. So something like this. That automatically, in a single 22-word sentence, I know a lot about the methods of the paper. Okay, this sentence may actually be the last sentence of the introduction, or it may be the only sentence in a subheading called overall study design. Or it may be just the first sentence of the study participants subheading. Okay. I'm gonna scan ahead. This is sort of listing what are the typical study designs. Often there's a special case, in which case you have to kind of explain clearly what you did. Program evaluation is often a typical one. It's not typical epidemiological study design, but it's very typical in public health. Yeah, I'm gonna skip, and I may even go to the ending. I think I'll have to, there are other sections that you can self-examine on your own. So let me see if this is a place I can end. Ethical considerations. Maybe I'll end on the last bit. You should have somewhere in the paper, at a minimum, that says something like these 2 sentences. The study protocol was reviewed and approved by the Ethics Committee of Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Journals will say, give us the protocol number for the IRB. They want you to specifically say whether written or verbal informed consent was obtained, and if not, an explanation for why not. That's the minimum. If you have special vulnerable populations, such as children, people with diminished mental capacity, prisoners, for example, then much more is needed. So example, if your studies on people deprived of liberty, you'll have to say something about whether they received special privileges, how information was kept private, whether the IRB had a prisoner's advocate on it, and if data were anonymous or kept separately from prison records and jail health. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna end there. I don't want to go over. So I will say that you can catch the last bit of the methods section that I had to rush through. And there are actually, I think we might, even these 3 sessions only covered half of what the slides do. So I have a whole section on abstracts, titles, references, choosing a journal, peer review, response and revision, authorship, ethics of publishing, that you're welcome to look at, to use. And I know many of you actually are leaders are either professors yourself or lead research units that you have people that can benefit to share these with. Feel free to use them any way you wish. And I can stay around. I'm free to stay for questions, but I know I've kept people for a while.
Yeah, there's one question up here right now. Can you please, excuse me, can you please advise of the similarities and dissimilarities, if there are, between the concepts of methods and methodology?
Yeah. Methodology is this very more theoretical construct. I feel it's more often used in social sciences, relating more to how they're grounding their measures in theoretical frameworks and models, whereas you can kind of tell that I've geared my paper instructions to epidemiology, public health, clinical research, quantitative studies. Their methods refers much more, it's much more procedural, much more the steps, the epidemiological designs, the steps that you take, the procedures, where the questionnaires are coming from, the laboratory procedures, less theoretical. So I'd say methodology elevates sort of to a higher theoretical level. For the most part, I think quantitative studies, the heading should be methods, not methodology. If it starts with methodology, I'm expecting to see a lot more behavioral theory, maybe implementation science may begin with methodology rather than methods. Whereas if you're just going to say, look, here's how we did this, here's how we did the lab, here's how we did the recruitment, here's how we did the measures, it's methods.
Okay, there's another question up here. What is the role of co-corresponding author in the publication process? Can you give us more explanation about corresponding author and co-corresponding authors?
Yeah, co-corresponding author is something that I feel is relatively new. It used to be that you could only have one corresponding author. And I think even now, most journals would only allow one corresponding author. But to back up, what's the role of corresponding author? The role of the corresponding author, they're actually the one probably doing the submission. They're uploading. So they may or may not be the first author. They're often the last author, which is designated as the senior author. Actually, I have a whole 25 slide set on authorship in this next, so you can look there as well. The corresponding author is a level of honor, but it's also a level of responsibility. When someone sees that someone is designated the corresponding author, they're going to say, aha, this person was probably the principal investigator of the study. This person is probably the full professor who's advised the first author and other authors. So it denotes a very high level of honor and respect. So it's best to be first author, true. But if you're first in corresponding, that almost garners all that responsibility and all the prestige. What you often see is the first author is first, and that's the person that really wrote the paper from beginning to end and got input from the co-authors. If the corresponding author is the last one, that's probably the PI. And they're actually the one who are going to take responsibility for the revisions. They vouch for the integrity of the data. They can produce the data. And 20 years from now, when that young grad student who was the first author is going on to other jobs, that's the one that people will write to. That's the one whose address is there to say, hey, you did this study 20 years ago. I need to ask you a question about it. So they will, in perpetuity, be the one to answer for the study. Which is why I find it odd that there can be co-corresponding, because that really makes it a little bit murky over who is the PI, who is the person to go to. I imagine it comes about because there's ever increasing amounts of things like multiple PIs on grants, joint PIs on grants, that they legitimately can be co-corresponding. But it does make it murky. And if I remember in the past, journals would force you by the upload of only designating one corresponding author. So I think I am vaguely aware that there are journals that are allowing co-corresponding, but I've never done it, to be honest. I have done co-senior authors, where the second to last and last are considered close to being the same as senior. And there's co-first authors, where the lead authorship is equal between two or more people. And that is designated on the title page. It'll say these two authors contributed equally as first authors to the paper. That's been happening for many years.
We have two questions from Ali here. What is your opinion about using quote based on copy paste from references rather than continuous paraphrasing? That's the first question.
Yeah. So on one level, if something is in quotations and cited for a source, that is perfectly legitimate. That is totally acceptable in scientific and literary standards, that the quotation marks denote that this was said by someone else and it's attributed to where it came from. That's perfectly acceptable. However, it's hard to write concisely a whole introduction section with so many quotations of what other people said. So you may be limited to just one or two such quotations. But as long as it's attributed and as long as it appears in the punctuation quotation marks, it is legitimate. But I wouldn't rely on it too much. Paraphrasing, you also have to be careful. The machinery of plagiarism can detect a certain level of paraphrasing. In other words, one is called thesaurus plagiarism, where you lift a sentence or a couple sentences and use a thesaurus to change different adjectives and nouns. Plagiarism detection machinery will find that. They are programmed to do that. So you can't be guilty of thesaurus plagiarism. Word order, substituting out equivalent words doesn't work. You have to rewrite the order. You have to kind of try to put it from memory in your own words as well. One exception that I use often is, again, in the method section. As I said, most editors will know that method sections will often be flagged as plagiarism because there's only so many ways you can say very standard procedures that are done. It's particularly statistical. Or that you're doing a secondary analysis and other papers have been published on the same study. Then the method section inevitably will sound similar because it actually is the same study. What I do there is say very clearly, say the details or the study has been previously published in detail. We paraphrase key parts of the methods here. So there's no doubt that you're paraphrasing. And anything that the machinery of plagiarism detection flags as potential plagiarism is headed by saying, yes, we are paraphrasing because this is a study. We've attributed it to that study, and we've said we've paraphrased it. That's to avoid the inevitability that papers on the same study are going to sound similar in their method sections. Yeah.
Okay, his second question was, will it be okay to mention a junior colleague as the last author if there are only two authors?
Well, if there's only two, someone has to be last. Of course. In social science, actually, I should say this, those rules that I'm giving you are much more about clinical research and public health research. And there's difference in culture. The social science order is less a thing. Social science tend to want fewer authors. That anyone listed is much more equal for the credit as who is 1, 2, and 3. So yes, of course. And I think it's also rare to say these two authors contributed equally when there's only two there. So simple answer to your question is yes, of course, if there's two, someone has to be last, someone has to be first. You can make a note that it's equal or not say that, and people might assume that. But with clinical and public health publications, it's first of all increasingly customary to list many, 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 many authors. It's basically the style of clinical medicine. 15 authors, 8 authors, 9 authors, 10 authors. That is routinely done. Partly it's author inflation, partly publications that have more authors get more citations. cynically thinking it's probably because they're citing themselves. So you have more authors to cite themselves. When you have so many authors, the order starts to matter more because 1, 2, and 3 are often said in the reference section, followed by et al. So in other words, if you like to see your name in lights, it's very important to be 1, 2, or 3 because you get et al. Out of the rest of it. And then the last author has traditionally been this PI senior author, senior investigator. So if you only had 2 or 3 authors, it's a different sort of culture and style that's being followed.
Oh my, you have 5 questions right now. Okay. Can you kindly comment on using numbers and decimal places in your results or research? For example, a prevalence of 55.7 or 56%, which one is more useful?
Yeah, I have a very fixed rule in my head about this. Obviously, it's not illegal to do this, but I always look for this, that the number of decimal places in the tables should be exactly what's said in the results. So it should be 55.6 and 55.6. Prevalence was 55.6 in words, and the table says it. And they should all be that way. I even put to the extent that I would go, if it's 55.0, I put 0.0. Although you can tell that that's not strictly necessary. And those should be the same in the abstract that way. And here's why. Reviewers are looking to catch you in a mistake of your data. And sometimes it's just because you revised a table and forgot to revise the text or vice versa. So their eyes will be toggling back and forth from what you write in the results to where you state the numbers in the table. So if you start rounding off, it drives them crazy. Because if they see, okay, this one was 56.6 and they say about 56%, and this one is 56.2, wait a minute, I'm lost. So it frustrates me, it frustrates readers. In the abstract, it should also be the same because a sloppy scholarship is to cite figures that only when you've read the abstract. You shouldn't do this. You should read the whole paper if you're going to cite it. But embracing the reality is many people will only read your abstract to cite a figure. So it should be as precise in the abstract as it is in the table, as it is in the results section. Okay, but now I switch gears. For the discussion, the more you can make it rounding off or chatty, the better it is, because it avoids the impression that you are simply repeating results rather than the importance of the results. So in other words, if you said 55.6% prevalence in the results section, in the discussion, you say something like a majority of participants were living with HIV, or more than half of the participants were living with HIV. That's placing a more value on it. It's placing an interpretation on it. It's chatting to anybody that's not numbers oriented of why it's important and significant. I even do it down to like if it's 13 or 14% in the discussion, I switch to 1 in 7 were living with HIV. It's roughly the same, but it sort of has this easier way of communicating to people. So discussion, make it flow, make it wordy, make it lay accessible. Don't go down to the decimal place in the discussion. But tables, results, and abstract, these are things that people are going to try to catch you in a mistake, a calculation, or they're going to cite it and say, it was 55.6. I'll also say this, they like it precisely. If they're doing this sloppiness in the abstract, if they're going to cite a paper, they'll cite the one that has the more precise figure in the abstract. Because if you said, a little more than half were living with HIV, they're going to not cite it. They're going to say it was 55.6% in Uganda. It was 30%, 30.1% in Mexico, whatever it would be. Yeah, so that's my advice. I do have strong feelings on that. I'm sorry.
Okay, when one is writing the conclusion after the discussion, should he rephrase the main message from the discussion as a take-home information?
So we're talking about the difference between what's the mission accomplished paragraph where you state the main findings, and then this separate conclusion section. where it feels a bit repetitious. If the question is can I repeat that main take-home message? I would say yes, you can. And that becomes a fifth place where you drive the take-home message home. And I'm saying this especially if it is a separate heading, it's okay to repeat the message again. Paraphrase yourself a little bit differently, perhaps, or begin it with in summary, and you can repeat it. The repetition is a good communication tool in this sense. But again, it's not, the repetition isn't saying the odds ratio is 2.15, confidence, 95% confidence interval, 1.87 to 3.2 flat. That's not the repetition I'm talking about, but the communicative title, the communicative headliner, take home message. Yes, it's okay to repeat it and can be good practice.
Dr. McFarland, do you have any thoughts about self-citing and appropriate ways to do so? There is some guidance out there, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. And she emphasizes self-citing as using your writing from previous papers in the current one.
Yeah, it's always been considered poor taste to do it. Again, I don't think for many years, it wasn't strictly forbidden or explicitly forbidden by journals. But it is, so I'll just take it on multi-levels. It's considered kind of poor taste. On another level, it's less scientific because if you're looking to corroborate something, like if you want to make a statement like, it's been widely documented that this has been found, and then you cite mostly yourself, that draws question, right? But if you're saying other researchers, if you're citing this has been documented worldwide, and you cite 3 other researchers operating on 3 different continents who you have never published with before, that lends a higher level of scientific integrity to backing it up. So I think culturally and scientifically, it is stronger not to cite yourself. Whether or not journals are explicitly forbidding this, I think you have to look at their instructions. I would think for the most part, they're not. And then, of course, there are some exceptions. Like if you've published before on this particular study, you definitely should cite yourself because you want to say we've previously documented the main outcome or another topic. We've previously detailed the methods. Then you want to attribute that, and that would be yourself. Does that answer the question? Read the instructions, but it's also considered less scientific and less culturally acceptable in the scientific world. But it happens all the time.
Okay, yeah, she says yes, thank you. Somebody says, correct me if I'm wrong, but junior colleague can also be last if in that particular paper they had the responsibility of acting as the senior author or as advisor.
Yeah, it is actually up to the first author to kind of ensure what the right order is. So if they felt that that last author was someone who has access to the data, was integral to writing the study, and is someone who stands out as maybe accounting for all pieces, then I think it's legitimate. I'm wondering though, I'm putting the question back, why not do joint first authorship? To me, it feels like if 2 junior investigators were putting this together, working collaboratively, under the professorship or lab directorship of someone else, that maybe they genuinely jointly should be both first authors, and you can indicate that on your CV. You can indicate that clearly on the journal. I guess I'm shying away from that last position because the image of that last author is someone old, someone who's run their own lab for a long time, someone who will always forever be able to answer for it and not go on to other jobs. I feel like you have a specific paper that maybe you did put your junior colleague last, but let me assure you that's perfectly okay. It's quite an honor to be last author. I'll tell you on my CV, and I recommend this to my mentees, on your CV, you're obviously listing your publications, but right there you can say peer-reviewed publications. In parentheses, you put in asterisks and you say first, senior, or corresponding author. In other words, you're going to designate in that list of all your publications how many times you were first, last, or corresponding. So joint first would count. Joint last, joint corresponding, all of those would also count on your CV. But you've done your junior colleague a great honor by putting them there. Let me put it that way.
Last question is, if I am the last author of the manuscript, but first author is the corresponding author, then who is the senior author?
You're still going to be called, the last author will still be considered the senior author in the culture of clinical research.
And another question just popped up. When suggesting reviewers for your article, what are the things to look out for as reasons for choosing them?
That's good. Well, there are ethical milestones for choosing co-authors, first of all, that you should consider. It should be no one from your current institution, no one from your immediate preceding institution, no one you've published with in the last 5 years, no one that you were co-investigators on a grant in the last 5 years, and no one that you have a pending grant under review or a paper under review, as should be designated as potential reviewers. I might have missed a few, but the idea is there can be no hint of conflict of interest in choosing a potential reviewer. So avoid all those things. Aside from that, it's a double-edged sword to choose people that you know. I mean, you do want someone who understands the importance of your work, that understands the methodology, is one that is typically applied and appropriate in your study. So you can look at who has published on the topic and list them as well. If you're too familiar with them, though, be careful, because A, you don't know if they're going to sabotage you or feel competitive, and B, there might be this appearance of conflict of interest. Oh yeah, it shouldn't be someone you've been married to or dated either. So one way that I do it when I'm at a loss for who might be totally appropriate, and you're asked to name 5 in some cases, it's so difficult to come up with 5 appropriate, is you'll see it in my slide set. There's a journal finder called the Journal Author Name Estimator, or JANE. JANE is a wonderful tool. If you're not aware of it, try it. It's Journal Author Name Estimator. You can Google it and find it. You plunk in your title or your abstract or a chunk of your paper, and JANE will tell you the journals that are the best match. There's another button on JANE that says authors that match that topic, and JANE will say these are the authors that have published on something that matches you best. That's often a very independent view of authors that you can use as potential peer reviewers. So JANE will list them JANE will list them in the order of how often they've published on your specific topic. I find it very good, and it'll come up with many people that you don't have a conflict of interest with. Lastly, having said all this, there's no guarantee that the editor will use those people. In fact, they're mostly doing this to build their own database of contacts that they can use as reviewers. And there's no guarantee that if they offer the review to these people, they'll accept it. In fact, 9 times out of 10, the reviewer will decline. So they are mostly trying to do this to build their own potential database of reviewers. Oh, someone found it. Yeah. Yes. It doesn't. Well, there are links to the articles. You can also click a button that says articles. So if it says Journal of Urban Health is the one publishing most on this topic, it will give you the top articles in that journal. So you can use it as a search engine as well. I'd recommend it for that as well. But yeah, it'll lead you to the link in PubMed.
Another question popped up. How to judge index journal? How do you judge if an index journal is of higher quality, or how to choose a good journal to get my research published?
Yeah, that's good. So Jane, actually, the note was, thank you, it does pull data from PubMed only. So that already is a filter on some that are, a filter on the journals that are not going to be indexed in PubMed. So that's already one layer. Another is the worry of these predatory journals. I would say a rule of thumb is never submit to a journal that invites you to submit to them. It sounds harsh, but the chance that they're predatory is very high. And when they're predatory, what this means is you submit, you may have to pay them to publish, first of all, or even worse, they hold your paper for ransom, that once you submit it, they own it because you sign the copyright over to a journal, and then they won't release it. So you can't publish it anywhere else. So never respond to a solicitation in your email from a journal asking you to publish with them. There may be some legit, but so often that is going down the route of being trapped, and it's predatory. You can Google, is this journal predatory? And they will, there's websites that document these predatory practices. So you may see it on one of their lists. Yeah. So another, I mean, often the journal is picked because your mentor or senior author knows what journal, they're familiar with the field, and they know what's a good journal to publish in. So more often than not, your advisor, your mentor, your senior author, PI, if you're junior, they often know, they can steer you to what they think is the right one. Jane is a great tool. I think Jane is often correct in the choices. Jane will rank them like 1 to 80 or whatever of journals that are possible. Another one is if you look at your own references, you'll see that there are certain journals you're citing all the time. That's a big hint that that's the right journal for you to submit to. It's not the case. I mean, you might worry, well, doesn't that mean they've already published all they want to publish on that? Usually not. It usually means they're more interested in it. The more someone specializes in something, the more they're interested in that. So it often means their editorial board and their reviewers are very interested in that topic, even though they've published a lot on it. Of course, the impact factor is the prestige, is a measure of the prestige. It's a measure of how often people cite your public. If you publish in that journal, it's some measure of how often you're likely to be cited. And your prestige as a researcher is also not just the number of publications, but how often you're cited, your work is cited. So the impact factor, which Jane will give, I think, as well. Yeah. Which is this one here? Oh, it's another avenue to scientific writing courses. Yeah, there are many out there. And many are good.
Oh, and Elizabeth just commented again, my apologies for all the extra information, but I work with Jane regularly. Jane, it also includes the IGEN factor, I'm sorry, which is an article influence metric. It's not equivalent, the impact factor, but similar.
Yeah, it's not quite the same, but has a calculation that feels a little, it's not like you'd have to go back and Google the journal overall to get the real impact factor. But that is really an influence factor on that topic and publications on that topic. Yeah. I know, do you like Jane? I feel Jane works very, very well. There are other journal selection websites, but they often are the publishers only. In other words, if it's Springer or Lippincott Wilson, they'll steer you to their family of journals. Jane is independent of that.
Yeah, I'm assuming Elizabeth raising her hand means she says yes to liking Jane.
Yeah. I can't help thinking of it as a her because the name's Jane.
Right. And Edward
We say,
too.
we say like, well, what journal should I publish in? I say, well, ask Jane. And I've said that without thinking that they may not have heard of it. Like, who's Jane? Why is she so knowledgeable?
Oh, it looks like that is all. Oh, that's all the questions for now.
Great.
Okay. All right. So I think we do not have any more questions. So I'd like to thank all those who attended the webinar. So we'll be communicating any additional activities through the IEA platform. For example, the in-person scientific writing workshop that you are planning for next year. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. McFarland for facilitating all the 3 parts, your time that you've invested in this. We really learned, and we are looking forward to hosting you during the in-person scientific writing workshops. So we'll keep you posted regarding the planning of that. And Samantha, you'll be sharing the slides with everyone who have registered for the webinar, right?
Yes, and I've been collecting emails from everyone who also requested it. Like I said in the chat, please just be aware that it will not be today. It'll probably be tomorrow, due to the recordings taking a while to upload to the cloud. Regardless, if you ask for this recording, I'm just gonna send everybody the same thing, which is gonna include all 3 of them. So look out for that email. Hopefully it'll be tomorrow.
All right, thank you. We have Dr. Armand, who is the counselor for the African region. I'm not sure if he wants to comment anything about the in-person scientific writing workshop that is planned for next year.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe I don't have much to say. We are still on the preparation for that workshop, and I think we'll make sure that it happens. Thank you once more for the speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Dr. McFarland, for the excellent presentations. We learned a lot, and we are looking forward to the workshop.
Thank you. It's fun. And me too.
And thanks, Samantha, for the support.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. All
Bye.
right.